Okay, so welcome everyone to this next ZEF colloquium. Today we have a presentation by Lisa Biber-Freudenberger, who will present her recent project, LANUSYNCON, as well as some first research work related to this project. Just let me know that this meeting is being recorded. So in case you are worried about your own data, you might decide not to follow. So Lisa, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Sunita, for the introduction. My name is, as just said, Lisa Biber-Freudenberger. I think most of you know me, and I have been working at ZEF for quite some time now, and since July last year, I started this project called LANUSYNCON, which is funded by the FUNA initiative of the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. And LANUSYNCON stands for Land Use Synergies and Conflicts within the framework of the 2030 Agenda. And so that is basically what we are looking at. So it's in the title. And when we talk about the Agenda 2030, of course, we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. And the thing is, with the Sustainable Development Goals, society and in particular policymakers in the United Nations have agreed that by 2030, we want to achieve these goals. This is where we want to end up somehow. The problem is that we actually don't know really how to get there. Right? The basic idea is that the society and policymakers take some decisions and implement policies that are then influencing the system as a whole and therefore lead to certain impacts, thereby achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. But we are basically facing two problems here. One is that the interactions between the SDGs make the system quite complex. So there are a lot of conflicts, but also a lot of synergies between these SDGs, and there are a lot of impacts you might have with a decision that you did not really anticipate before. So when you are taking a decision, you can't really be sure if you're ending up with the outcome that you're anticipating, or maybe even also additional outcomes that you didn't expect before. So we have this high level of complexity. And the other problem we're seeing is that policy making is not really designed to deal with this level of complexity. And this is because policy making usually takes place in silos. So there are ministries for different SDGs that are taking certain decisions to achieve one SDG without necessarily considering all the different complexities in the system and the synergies and trade-offs that I just talked about. So these are the two major issues that we want to look at the project LANUSYNCON. So what we are asking is, how are the different SDGs in the context of land use interlinked with each other? So where are these linkages? Which decision options are being discussed to achieve certain SDGs? And then how would that then impact these conflicts and synergies and these interactions between the SDGs? And are these complex interactions between SDGs actually addressed in science policy interfaces as well as national policies? So do they really consider them, or don't they consider them? So these are the three main research questions we're looking at. Now we have three different work packages. The first one is the systematic assessment of the interlinkages of SDGs in the context of land use. And the second one, so in the first one, we are looking at these different interactions. The second one are different case studies that are taking place in Eastern Africa, where doctoral students are looking at specific interlinkages between sets of SDGs in the context of land use and specific decisions, how they are influencing these SDGs. And then the third work package is the analysis of the science policy interfaces. And so now I'll just briefly explain what we intend to do in these three different work packages. So the first work package where we want to analyze the interlinkages between the SDGs and the land use context, the idea is that we're utilizing a tool called dynamic Bayesian network analysis. And the nice thing about this tool is that we can do what-if scenarios. So we can ask different questions that have policy relevance. So we can ask, what if roads would not cut through a protected area, but would maybe go around it? How would that impact biodiversity? How would it impact the people? What if we would subsidize ecological agriculture? Or what if renewable energy production for global markets would increase in an area? How would that impact the people? How would it impact the land use? What we can do with these dynamic Bayesian network analysis is integrate a lot of the knowledge that we are actually already having. So we can use existing indicators and metadata, and we can integrate them. We can also integrate knowledge from case studies. That would be then the second work package. And we can use the knowledge of experts as well as literature that is out there and integrate it. So it can be used to summarize basically a lot of knowledge and make it also therefore policy relevant. And then we can use this model not only by saying something about probabilities and numbers, but we can also do that in a spatially explicit way and develop spatially explicit land use models. And then using these models to say something about how are certain decisions likely to impact the different SDGs. Now, to explain a little bit how these different models work. So what the first step is developing a conceptual impact pathway. So, and you have your different SDGs, and then you might ask, how are they connected with each other? So here we have, for example, the SDG Zero Hunger and Life on the Land. And obviously both of them are impacted by agricultural measures. And these agricultural measures are having certain impacts on the fertilizers you're using as well as the pesticides, which are then impacting the yield and therefore have an impact on the achieving SDG 2. However, agricultural measures are also impacting agricultural area as well as deforestation and therefore the biodiversity that you can conserve on the land. And of course, the pesticides have also an impact on biodiversity. And then there are a whole bunch of other indicators or factors that also play a role. So what's the land tenure situation? Are there being subsidies being paid? What's the current land price? What's the market access situation of a farmer? How's the gender balance, the gender equality? Do the farmers have access to information and these things? And then of course also what type of crop are we talking about? What's the soil quality that's impacting again? What crop is the farmer planting and what's the climate? And there you can already see that there are connections then to the other SDGs. So for example, to infrastructure when we talk about market access or land price, but also to energy when we talk about access to information as well as the climate. So this is the idea that we are developing these more holistic and systematic models where we are then analyzing what if we now would increase the subsidies for certain agricultural measures, for example. So that brings me now to the second work package 2, where we are looking at specific interactions between SDGs. And I'm not going to talk about all the different case studies because that would take too long. And I also think the doctoral students should rather talk about this at some point. So I'll just briefly mention all of the different case studies that we're having, which are looking at Kenya and Tanzania, now also including South Sudan. So we have one work package that's working on renewable energy innovations and their impact on land use in Kenya, asking the question, what are the impacts of renewable energy innovation and adaptation, and how does that influence how people are utilizing land? The second case study is looking at biodiversity conservation and food production and agriculture in Kenya, asking what is the potential of different agricultural schemes and policies to achieve food security and biodiversity conservation. And then we have two studies that are looking at Tanzania, looking at infrastructure development and biodiversity conservation, and looking at the question, how do different alternatives for road infrastructure development compare in terms of costs and benefits for the people as well as biodiversity. And then the work package 2D is also looking at biodiversity conservation, but in combination with access to land. So how can conservation and rural livelihood development and wildlife corridors be optimized under different land use restrictions and resettlement scenarios? And then now we have a new case study that's now also included, which is looking at South Sudan and also looking at biodiversity conservation and livelihoods, but this time not in agricultural systems, but in the forest system, asking the question, what is the impact of different forest management strategies on biodiversity conservation and ecosystem services? If you want to find out more about the case studies, you can definitely look at our website, or also send an email to one of the doctoral students or listen to their presentations at some point. Now, then we have our third work package, which is the science policy interface analysis. And here we are interested how these science policy interfaces, so IPCC, IPBS, how are they considering these conflicts and synergies between the different SDGs in the assessments and the products that they are generating. So these science policy interfaces, they are generating from these large reports that you all know. But how much does, for example, a report from IPCC consider conflicts or synergies with biodiversity, and vice versa? How much do reports from IPBS consider synergies and conflicts with climate change? And this is what we want to look at. We also want to understand, how do these science policy interfaces collaborate with each other, and how much do they work with each other to also look at these synergies and trade-offs. And then how do these assessments and products then influence, again, national policy making and therefore conflicts and synergies on the ground? So this would be work package 3. And of course, the work is supposed to also to be integrated between the different work packages. So we have different decision options that we're looking at, and we are using participatory analysis to develop then an inter- and transdisciplinary decision model with this Bayesian network modeling approach that I just explained, where we are integrating expert knowledge, but also indicators and metadata analysis, as well as data collection in the field, which is, of course, at the moment not really taking place, also due to Corona, but also we wouldn't have started now. Anyhow, we hope that we can start with that then in this year sometime. And then we are going to translate this also in spatial land use models, and using sensitivity analysis to actually look at where are specific knowledge gaps that we still need to fill. And so we'll not just randomly collect any data in the field, but we'll really try to aim to collect data that are filling these knowledge gaps that we'll figure out through the sensitivity analysis. And then we have the science policy interface analysis, where we're looking at how much are they influencing national policy making, but also how much are they considering these complexities in their products. And then we will integrate the findings to develop recommendations, as well as a useful tool to support coherent land use decision making, as well as SPIs in their institutional design. So this is how we are going to integrate the different findings over the project. Now, obviously, we are at the beginning, so there are the doctoral students are still participating in the doctoral courses. However, we have already done some work in terms of metadata analysis and literature review in particular. So that's what I'm going to talk about now in the remaining time. And I'll come back to this idea that we are thinking about, what kind of decisions do we need to take to influence the system to reach certain impact. And in a literature review, we were looking at the example of private governance through sustainability certification. So basically labeling products in mainly agricultural products, with the idea of changing markets and producer behavior to then in the end transform agriculture and make it more sustainable in different dimensions. And so what we did was a systematic literature review, where we asked the question, does sustainability certification have the potential to drive sustainability transformation in the primary sector? And we looked at 176 different articles which analyzed sustainability outcomes of sustainability certification. And we looked at what did they find out in terms of, was it that they found out it had a positive impact, it had a mixed impact depending on different situations, or was it rather negative impact or no impact? We looked at the dimension. So what kind of, did they look at social sustainability, environmental sustainability, or economic sustainability? We looked at were those studies actually measuring? Was it an intermediate outcome? So things like, did they just reduce pesticides or pay premium prices to farmers? Or did it actually have an impact on the endpoint variables? Did they measure endpoint variables in terms of the ultimate sustainability goals? So things like improved biodiversity or lower poverty. Because in the end, these paying premium prices, for example, is something that you want to achieve lower poverty with. But the ultimate goal is not the premium prices, but the lower poverty. So what did the studies measure? Did they measure intermediate variables or endpoint variables? We also assessed other information, things like what kind of research approach did they use, what kind of data sources, when was the publication published, in which country did it take place, what was the type and the name of the sustainability certificate they were looking at, what kind of sector did they look at, what kind of product, what farm type, and so on. And also we looked at different context variables in the countries where the studies took place. So the Human Development Index, the size of the agricultural sector, and many other. So coming now to the findings, what we found out was that overall, fewer studies found positive impacts than negative impacts. So generally speaking, most studies actually didn't find a positive impact of certification schemes. And that was true more or less over the whole period that we looked at. Obviously, we found a relatively big increase in number of publications, as you would expect to find in a literature review nowadays. But the share of negative findings actually even rather increased slightly over time. We also looked at different sectors, as I just said, and different sustainability certificates. And I just want to mention them in case you don't know them or you're interested in looking at specific certificates closer. So we have these 3 different sectors, which is forestry, farm agriculture, and fisheries. And the certificates we looked at was the Forest Stewardship Council, the Program for Endorsement of Forest Certification, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and then for the agricultural sector, farm agricultural sector, we looked at the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, Global Gap, Rainforest Alliance, UTS. You probably know that these 2 actually recently merged. We looked at the Roundtable on Responsible Soy, Fair Trade, including also then Fair Trade Organic, 4C, and Bonsucro, and the Better Cotton Initiative. And then in the fisheries, we looked at the Friends of the Sea, Marine Stewardship Council, the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, and then we looked at the different how are the impacts of studies divided by the different certificate schemes. And what we found was that there are no significant differences between the different certificates. However, of course, we have, for some certificates, we have fewer studies than for other certificates. So we have, for example, a lot on FSC, but for anything 4C and SFI and PEFC, we have relatively few studies. But for all of them, there were actually no significant differences. Some of them were doing a little bit better. The Rainforest Alliance was doing, for example, a little bit better, and Global Gap, while UTS, for example, was doing relatively bad, or RSPVO as well. So, but overall, we didn't find any significant differences between the different certificates. So I think that's quite interesting. We also looked at the different study designs. So was it a qualitative experimental, qualitative non-experimental, quantitative non-experimental, or quantitative experimental? And also there we didn't find significant differences. So as you can see, quantitative non-experimental were doing slightly better maybe than qualitative non-experimental, but all of these differences were not significant. The same is true for the data sources. So it didn't really matter that much if we looked at direct observation, documents, interviews, or panel data, or large surveys. All of them were more or less similar in their distribution of positive and negative outcomes. However, we found one significant outcome. So I'm not showing you all the non-significant ones now, but just focusing now on the ones where we found something significant, which was when we compared intermediate and endpoint variables. So what we found was that studies focusing on intermediate variables were finding significantly more positive outcomes than those looking at endpoint variables. So it's 41% versus 22% here. So if a study actually looked at the final impact in terms of SDG, there was not a lot of impact, most of the studies, or no impact or negative impact. But if we just looked at the intermediate outcomes, so if farmers got actually paid premium prices, then we found more positive outcomes. And that was also true when we divided it up for the different dimensions, at least for social and economic, not for environmental. So that actually tells us that in particular for social and economic, we are not actually ending up at the SDGs where we would like to end up with, and the impact where we would like to end up with. But for biodiversity, we actually already have an idea what we need to do to have the impact on the ground that we want to have. So I think it's quite an interesting result. And I just want to now summarize this. So we were asking the question, does sustainability certification have the potential to drive sustainability transformation in the primary sector? And so overall, the answer I think has to be rather no. So because overall we found negative or no effect studies. And they were just more predominant than the ones with a positive impact. And that was generally speaking independent of study design, sustainability dimension, or study context, and also independent of the certificate type or sector that we were looking at. And what we found, however, was that studies looking at these intermediate variables were more likely to find positive outcomes than those looking at endpoint variables. And what that actually tells us is that the actors and the sustainable certificates designs, they lack this capacity to control for this complexity that I talked about at the beginning, and therefore the unintended consequences. And I think this is a nice example why this work of what we intend to do in LANUSYNCON is so important, because what we are trying to look at are actually this complexity and these unintended consequences of decision making. And so with that, I would like to end, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa, for this very interesting presentation. I think we all here at ZEF would agree that looking at synergies and trade-offs between different SDGs is a very important topic. I suppose many of ZEF researchers have worked on relatively narrow specific SDGs, but without taking this broader perspective. So that's something that was definitely missing. So thank you again for your presentation, and now we can open the floor for the discussion. So in case you have questions or comments to Lisa, you can either raise the blue hand or you can use the chat option as well. we get any question from the public. I found it very interesting in your results that you had these very different figures for the intermediate and endpoint outcomes. And I actually, during your presentation, I was wondering about this time horizon of SDGs, because I mean, SDG is planned till 2030, but how it would look like if we thought in a if we thought in a very much longer term dimension, not only in the next decade, but what's happening after 2030. Is it going to be the same thing like with Millennium Development Goals, or? I
know. I mean, it's. I don't know. I mean, now this is, I guess, also a political question, but I mean, we have seen this in the past with a lot of goals, with the Millennium Goals, as you just said. We have seen this in biodiversity conservation a lot, where goals were set. I mean, I still have a button, I think, from the 2010 goals or 2010 targets of the CBD, which were also completely missed. I think the question is if policymakers, so I think there are two questions. One is, will they be able to actually develop these coherent policies where we are ending up where we actually want to go? And at the moment, I don't see this happening. So if I look, for example, at the EU climate policies, where they are basically subsidizing burning forests since it's biomass, I don't think that this is where we really want to end up. And I think as long as things like climate change, biodiversity conservation are not ranking really high on the political agenda, then we will again fail these targets. I think it's also a matter of priority setting and actually doing what has to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Another point that I had in my mind was exactly about these policy priorities, because I think that when we talk about SDGs, it's not only about synergies or trade-offs between them, supposing that policymakers care about all SDGs equally, but I think achieving them usually requires a lot of financing needs, and policymakers act under restrained or constrained public financial capacities. So definitely they need to prioritize specific SDGs, which certainly gives them a lot of margin for doing politics maybe and not
yeah. But I think this is also changing now. I mean, now what we are seeing is that increasingly also the private sector is concerned about the impacts of climate change. And I think this is also going to happen with biodiversity loss, where the private sector is going to get more concerned. The more biodiversity we're losing, the more they are affected by it. And I mean, we know that it will be much more costly to deal with climate change and the impacts of biodiversity loss and climate change after it has happened than dealing with it now, and visualizing that, I think is quite important. And I think having some coherency in the policies that are utilizing the synergies that are existing. These would be the low-hanging fruit for policymakers, which I think they are not using enough at the moment. Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, maybe some questions or comments appeared, and I see Christian and then Denis. So Professor Burgermeister, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for this nice presentation. Just one question regarding this analysis of the certification agencies. I do remember that in cases where certification led to premiums paid for the products, and these kind of additional or this price hike ended up with the producers, that this in these cases had an effect on some social variables like schooling, health situation, etc. you didn't see this in your data?
Well, for that to tell you something about this, we would need to go back now to the individual papers. But so what we found was that even if there was an impact in terms of these intermediate outcomes, that we didn't have an ultimate effect. But if that was now the case, what the case for schooling was, I can't tell you now specifically. I can ask Thomas Dietz, because he was mainly doing the coding together with his scientific assistants. If they found something specific about schooling, or if there was some variation, but we didn't really differentiate between the single indicators in the social dimension there.
Okay, thank you. And now Denise, please.
Thank you, Sanetta, and thank you, Lisa. Very, very interesting, and I think it's a very complex challenge. I have just one question, because it's, I think, very relevant for countries in the South, particularly this, how to say this, of course, this divergence between industrialization and sustainability, and how you would capture this more specifically, particularly consider that extractivism, being agro-extractivism, mining, you know, this, particularly this oil palm and soya beans and all that is feeding industries sometimes in other countries, not necessarily in the same countries. But also in the same countries, there is this big challenge, no? Also interest groups, economics, political. So how you would reflect this complexity locally and globally with this research?
Yeah, so I mean, it's funny you're asking. So we had actually this one case study that is dealing with bioenergy. Was supposed also to look at land deals in Tanzania for bioenergy, and how, you know, land grabbing may play a role there. However, the thing is that due to developments in the oil market and things like this, it suddenly didn't have such an impact anymore in Tanzania. So it was rather difficult to capture this through data. What we can still do is capture this in the Bayesian network modeling. So we can say, you know, what if a country would export more or wouldn't do it, right? So, I mean, we are still developing these models, and they are supposed to be based on stakeholders' opinions and things like this. But if the local stakeholders, they are saying that this is having an impact on the SDGs, then this could go into the model. However, what we would be looking at is of course now the case of East Africa, and then also sometimes zooming in for specific questions. But you could still use that also for, you know, another region where the general connections between SDGs are similar. What we are also currently doing is, and that's together with a master student, we are using the data from the Environmental Justice Atlas, and we want to model the probability that additional conflicts, socio-ecological conflicts, are emerging in different regions of the world. It's not in East Africa in this case, but it's a global analysis using a little bit of different approach, but that would go in this direction. And yeah, if you're interested in that, then we can talk about this more. Maybe some other colloquium.
Great.
Some results.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. And now, Georgie, please.
Thank you, Lisa. Very nice presentation. Nice to learn a little bit more about your project. I wanted to quickly go back to the study that you presented about certification. I found that very interesting, especially given the other review studies that came out in the last 4 years. I think in the last 4 years, there were at least 4 other review studies that came out. But then the results are kind of the opposite of what you showed here. They show that there is well, mostly mixed results, closely followed by positive results, and then just a few studies that show actually negative results. I mean,
yeah, I think I think I need to specify negative also means no impact, right? This is also in there. Right? If it doesn't have any impact, because then you have still the investments and you're still doing something and paying more, but it actually doesn't have any effect on the social, economic, or
okay.
or
So in your case,
ecological.
negative, okay,
Yeah.
it's considering no results, but then mixed, what's...
Well, mixed is if it depends on certain aspects, right? If it depends on certain additional parameters that they were measuring in these studies.
Okay. But also another thing that caught my attention is that you guys include quite a lot of studies, while the other reviews that are out there, they include significantly less studies, fewer studies. So can you tell us a little bit what are the differences between the criteria that you all used to include these studies as opposed to the other reviews, I guess?
I mean, I don't know the criteria that the other studies now used by. I would need to look into that. I mean, what the criteria here were that the studies were looking at a specific certificate, and that they were somehow measuring sustainability outcomes. I think a lot of the other studies, they are not, for example, including qualitative studies, right? They are just including quantitative studies. So we took a rather broad approach, trying to also include studies that are not quantitative. And therefore, we also looked at if this would actually have an impact, which it didn't really, at least not significantly, on the outcomes. And I think that might make a difference in the number of studies that are actually being included or not. And I think what's also important to mention is that of course, sometimes you have studies that are taking, for example, different data sources or looking at different countries. And so whenever this was happening, so if there was, for example, a study that would take both a quantitative as well as a qualitative approach, then this would go in this figure, it would go in 2 times, right?
Okay.
It would be kind of treated like 2 cases. But the pure number of studies was 176 or something. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you. And now Salamatu.
Hello, Prof. Thanks for the beautiful presentation. My question was almost hinted on by one, but I'll continue. And it has to do with the private sector participation and the other aspect of primary extractives. I was thinking about mining, and it was mentioned because in Tanzania, I know they are also actively in mining, both large scale and small scale. And the mining sector is an area that the issue of climate change and biodiversity is so crucial. Mm-hmm. There had been attempts of integrating biodiversity for a long time. It wasn't working. And now climate change also comes. But from my little field work I did, I realized that there is impact of both issues on the communities, especially, and even the sector itself. So my question is how we are involving the private sector in this project.
Yeah, so I think there are 2 questions that you're asking. One is about the private sector, which can be related to mining, but doesn't necessarily have to be. And we are including the private sector, or we are planning to do this as stakeholders into developing these models to actually find out what the impact is of the private sector, and also how they are making their decisions. And how they are influencing the system, and are also influenced by policy making in terms of subsidies, for example. The other thing with mining, we don't have a case study on mining yet in our project. It could be probably integrated as well into it, but we simply don't have it in there yet. However, I think if it's playing a role in this context of that we're looking at the moment, then it might pop up, and we will collect some additional data on that as well. We have some funds for master students, so that could be an idea to include it there. But yeah, thank you. It's a good question to think about.
Thank you, Salamatu. Thank you, Lisa. Are there any other questions from the public? Maybe in the meantime, another question from me. I don't know much about certification and the literature, so I'm not sure if my question will make sense. But I was wondering if there are any studies of kind of cost benefit of certification, because I suppose certification implies some costs to producers as well. So in case you find that mostly the outcomes are either non-existent or even negative, does it make even sense to try to push still for this certification? Or maybe it would be better to divert these resources to some other forms of actions towards sustainability.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not an economist, but what we did was we also differentiated different practices according to their costs in this study, and we also didn't find a significant difference there, interestingly. So it also didn't have an impact. What kind of measures, if it was very costly measures or not that costly measures, that also didn't have an impact on the outcomes. Now, not in this study, but in a different study that I was part of, we actually also did Bayesian network modeling, not in that case for Europe, where we looked at different policy measures and which policy measures are most likely to have a positive impact on biodiversity outcomes on the field. Now, we didn't look at costs, but there we said we had different options, including direct regulation. So saying, we have a law that's basically banning harmful pesticides from the fields of Europe, and had some other restrictions. And then we had other things which were more focusing on market mechanisms or on subsidies and things like this. So rather the carrot and comparing the carrot stick approach, you could say. And what we found was that even if comparing all these different policy measures, and again, this is for Europe now, I don't know if it would have played out differently if we would have done that for Africa. But if we look at this for Europe, the measure that was the most promising one was actually the direct regulation. And not because they were putting so many additional things on the farmers and putting so many more restrictions, but simply because it was for all farmers. And the problem with certification is very often that you don't have this very big impact because not so many farmers are adopting it. So for example, organic farming, they just have a limited market share and a limited number of people that are willing to pay the price if they still have the opportunity to pay the lower price and have conventional products. And so I'm also not like the pure expert on certification. I'm starting to getting a little bit into this field, but from what I'm seeing so far is that what's happening very often is that farmers who are already producing rather sustainably, they are taking this as an opportunity to get more money and to be paid for it, which is fine, but they are not necessarily then getting, doing a lot more. While the farmers that are producing non-sustainably, they are not changing their behavior simply because it doesn't make sense for them economically, and it would require too many investment costs and all these things, and maybe the market share is not high enough and so on. So I think we really need to think about I'm not saying that we don't need certification at all. I think it can be still part of the puzzle, but I think what we really need are sustainable thresholds where we are saying farmers are supposed to meet at least those. This is like the minimum requirement, and I think they're not high enough at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And don't you think that maybe the fact that we observe exactly this lack of impact or relatively low impact on average, maybe they exactly mask some, I mean, these average impacts mask some heterogeneity, and that there are some farmers for whom the impacts might be very high, but on the other hand, some different groups of farmers might show negative impacts. And when you just take the average, yeah, you don't see anything.
Yeah, I mean, and we that's possible, and we are also seeing studies that are finding positive outcomes. So I'm not saying they don't exist, but that's, of course, the question is: do we really think that, you know, this is so there are also a lot of studies that actually find a negative or not positive impact. So the question is this really the way then maybe to go, or should we rather think about something else or something additional at least, right? And not just say we're going to focus on certification, privatization, and think that the market is going to regulate everything. Yeah, sure, there are probably farmers who are benefiting from it. I don't doubt that. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? I see no one.
George is having another one.
George.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit more on how or to what extent you plan on using the case studies that you organize into the work package to inform pretty much the modeling, right? That you will be the other two work packages.
Yeah, so some of those case studies are going to use Bayesian network modeling themselves, and the idea is to use the knowledge as well as the data that are being collected during these dissertations to then integrate them into a larger model where we are connecting the different pieces of the puzzle. And so what I expect from the doctoral thesis is basically to have a better understanding of the system dynamics, and then also what we need to quantify this model and not just have some nice picture with, you know, circles and arrows, is we need some probabilities behind this. And these can be expert-based, but they can be also data-driven. And this is what I hope to get out of the work that the doctoral students are doing, looking at the different interconnections and having like a knowledge base that we can then fall back on to integrate into this model. So the pool of experts, the literature that they have been collecting and analyzing, as well as the data that they are collecting themselves in the field.
Thank you. And Lisa, maybe based on your already existing results from your research, do you think that there is necessarily kind of conflict between, for example, achieving fast poverty reduction and sustainability at the same time? Or is there a way to do both and relatively fast?
Good question. Well, I mean, if I would be the leader of a developing country and I would need to think about strategies how to improve sustainability, I would not invest in lots of extractive industries, that's for sure. I wouldn't export all the resources and then buy back them very expensively again from the more developed countries, but I would probably try to invest in skills and knowledge in my country, and I think that's important. But while I would do it, I would also try to include knowledge and skills that relate to creating long-term sustainable strategies, because I think what we are not learning in school, and that includes developing as well as non-developed country, developing as well as developed country, is, you know, how to actually lead a sustainable life that is, you know, not diminishing our natural resources. And I think that's something that we should start teaching in kindergarten. No.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Any questions? Fatima?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for the nice presentation. I'm just wondering, in your previous presentation, you described the increasing the agricultural input will definitely increase the yield. But do you consider that these countries also suffer from food insecurity? So maybe how to include this, like, is not always the conflict between different SDGs, but sometimes even these countries, they facing a problem in achieving one of the SDGs, like food security, for example. So what about different scenario, maybe considering the biodiversity could also improve the food security?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the modeling task is to create different scenarios and use different policy options. So you could have, you know, one policy option that is basically focusing on providing pesticides and fertilizer to the rural population to just improve the yields, right? But thereby they would reduce biodiversity probably. While another option would be to use maybe integrated pest management and subsidize that. And that would have maybe positive impacts on food security, maybe not as cheap as having it just by supporting them with pesticides and fertilizer, but maybe then more on the long term, and thereby also improving biodiversity. So it's really about looking at how do the different policies influence different SDGs and which have the best potential to actually achieve different SDGs at the same time and not fall into this trap of these conflicting policy strategies.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any remaining comments? So maybe the last one, sorry, yeah. The last one from me, sure. Again, because you're one of the chapters of your project is going to focus on policy and science interface. Do you have any specific expectations with respect to how policymakers will be, you know, willing to implement different policy suggestions coming from the science?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually changing quite a bit in the last years. So, and it's very different. It's very heterogeneous if you look at different countries. So while some countries are, policymakers start to, you know, embrace scientific outcomes, and I think we can see that with the corona pandemic now. Other countries are very reluctant, and they're saying, we don't, you know, you're the scientists, we're the policymakers, we make the decisions. But I think it's quite interesting to look at what actually drives the implementation of science-based policymaking, and what are the factors that influence this, and therefore we have, it's actually now not just one doctor student, but we have another doctor student who go into the similar direction, but with the One Health program, but who's now also making the links for planetary health with LANUSYNCON. And so we're starting to look at different angles of this science policy interfaces and how policymakers and scientists, what the relationship between them are. And I don't think there's actually a lot of literature out there yet. And so far, I think policymakers have been policymakers in the past, and scientists have been scientists, and the policymakers were able to pick and choose which kind of science they use to support their policies. But I think this is not flying anymore. If we look at the climate change debate, and if we look at the Fridays for Future movement, the people, they start, and you know, they understand the science, and they are reading the science, and they are pushing for policymakers to use the science to make better decisions.
Great. So I suggest with this optimistic accent and message, yes, we can close this session. Thank you again, Lisa, for this very important, I think, research work, and thank you for your presentation. We are looking for more. Once you get more results, we will definitely want to have you back here. One notification: next week we will not have a ZEF colloquium because of the incoming Easter break, so we will meet just after the Easter break, but we will send you a proper email invitation to this next meeting. So thank you again, everyone, and thank you for your participation, and see you very soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.